All right, so welcome everyone to, I guess, the November 10th meeting of EGS. For those of you that know me, I'm AJ Easterday. I'm a game design and production student, a pre-junior at Drexel University with a concentration in game production, creative writing, anthropology, narrative design, and a lot of different aspects that mix into that. Today, we are doing a lovely panel with four lovely guest speakers who I'm going to go around real quick and introduce. First, we have Anne Converse Willkomm, who is the Assistant Clinical Professor and Assistant Dean of the Graduate Studies in the Goodwin College of Professional Studies. She re-envisioned the Masters of Science in Professional Studies and developed the Masters of Science in Nonprofit Management at Drexel. She advocates for the importance of communication and interpersonal soft skills. She serves on multiple committees throughout the university and has a background in education, banking, nonprofit management, psychology, and creative writing. On the side, she has a weekly blog for tools and advice on workplace professionals, which is how I actually found you originally. Along with her, we have Amanda Cullen. Amanda is a doctoral candidate of informatics at UC Irvine. She's studying gaming and entertainment culture. She studies in art as an ARC scholar, is a Twitch research fellow, and has been recognized as the tech maker in gaming at Google Stadia and a woman in gaming game changer by Microsoft and Xbox for her contributions to the gaming community. She has received her bachelor's and master's in anthropology from the University of West Florida and her master's in public service from the University of Arkansas Clinical School of Public Service. On the side, she immerses herself in pop culture and studies video game streaming, fan culture, and gender and sexuality studies. We also have Dr. Rose Corrigan. Dr. Corrigan is the Associate Dean for the Undergraduate Education at Klein Law and a law and society scholar with a focus in criminal justice, sexual violence, and social movements. She has worked in the fields of reproductive rights and sexual and domestic violence for over 15 years, including releasing publications on rape reform, feminist theory, and victimization, and her book, Up Against the Wall, Rape Reform and the Failure of Success, published in 2013. She was a faculty of John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the Department of Government from 2003 to 2006, awarded the postdoctoral fellowship with the American Association of University Women, and a visiting scholar with the Feminism and Legal Theory Project at Emory Law School in 2006. She currently holds a joint appointment between the law school and the Department of Politics. And finally, we have Rachel Sima, who some of you may recognize and spoke with us before, who is a game producer for over 4 years and worked in the industry guiding teams from 10 to 70 people developing games for PC, console, mobile, and VR. She's worked as a blog writer for a major esports company from 2014 to 2015, was a narrative designer and producer at Island Officials in 2015 to 2017, was a full-time producer at PHL Collective and Deck 9 Games, working on projects such as Life is Strange True Colors, and is currently a producer at Firaxis Games, working as a content producer on Marvel's Midnight Suns. I hope I got encompassed everything everyone does. Did anyone have anything they wanted to add before I kind of move us into the panel itself, or? Is that good? All right, great. Well, to give everyone a bit of background to what this panel is going to be about, as some people have probably seen in the news, on July 20th, 2021, the state of California filed a workplace discrimination lawsuit and harassment lawsuit against a game corporation known as Activision Blizzard. This lawsuit accused the corporation of complacency and support into the studio's frat bro culture, a culture where women were sexually discriminated and harassed against. To many of us in the game design industry, this lawsuit wasn't really a surprise. Discrimination and harassment have been a long and prolonged battle within gaming culture, one that comes up time and time again as new lawsuits are filed and new unions are formed. Whether in the case of Riot Games receiving letters requiring the company to send a notice to its workers to the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing, to the newly recognized United Casio workers demanding fair hours against crunch culture within the tabletop industry, we are in a time where gaming culture and harassment are two indistinguishable ideas that just come with the job description. But it doesn't have to be that way. And through self-advocacy and education, we hope today to bring to light personal strategies that you can implement into your work life to help you find a place that not only pays well, but treats you fairly. And with that, I think we'll kind of go into our first question of the night for everyone, and anyone can feel free to pipe in to answer first, which is, how do you define harassment and how is it different from other challenges that you see people face in the workplace? If anyone wants to go first. Should I call on people like the classroom? All right, how about Dr. Rhodes, if you want to go first?
Okay, so do you want me to do the sort of like a very general overview of the law around sexual harassment? Would that be helpful for folks?
I think that'd be really helpful, yeah.
Okay, so one of the first things I'll say as someone who has provided services to victims of sexual and domestic violence, sexual harassment for years, one of the first things I'll say is that experiences or feelings of harassment or violation don't always match up with legal definitions or legal remedies. So there can be really significant gaps, I would say, between law and justice. So that's just one thing. So what I'm going to talk about today are some of the legal definitions of sexual harassment, but I do want to be clear that for me, and I think for many people, this does not encompass all the experiences that people might have where they do feel that they have been discriminated against or violated. So one other caveat is I'm only going to talk about federal protections. As you mentioned, AJ, in your opening, right, California is pursuing the action against Activision, I think it was, right? So we have layers. There are federal protections, and then there are different protections at the state level. So what I'm going to talk about are only protections that are available nationally, but each state can have additional laws that might provide some additional protections, okay? And we just can't, talk about all the different states. So one of the first things I'll say is that sexual harassment at work is prohibited by law. It's prohibited under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The federal agency that's responsible for investigating sexual harassment is called the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or the EEOC. And I'll throw some links into the chat in a few minutes so that you can, if you wanted to, you could explore a little bit more. So Title VII prohibits two different kinds, and defines sort of two different kinds of sexual harassment. So one of those is what we call quid pro quo, which is, if you do something for me, I will do something for you. The other kind, which is much more common, is what we call sort of hostile workplace, which is where we have unwelcome conduct. And that conduct can be speaking, it could be touching, it could be nonverbal gestures, it could be sending around memes or videos that are of a sexual nature or that are based on someone's sex. The harassment is supposed to be severe or pervasive, meaning that it happens more than once, and that it affects someone's working conditions. Another thing that it's important to remember, so if we think about who's protected against sexual harassment, both women and men are protected against sexual harassment. In 1998, the Supreme Court affirmed that men could be victims of sexual harassment and could bring claims. So it's women and men who work for companies with 15 or more employees. Right. So for those of you thinking about startups, right, if you are working at a very small startup, there's the chance that a small organization might not be covered by federal statute. That doesn't mean there might not be state laws. And so just to mention also who's not protected. So obviously small organizations, and also independent contractors and freelancers and gig workers, which I'm guessing is probably another significant population of people entering the gaming industry. So, and again, states may have additional protections, but under federal law, independent contractors, freelancers are not covered. So what we know is that sexual harassment is pretty pervasive in the lives of working women in particular, depending on how it's defined. Studies show generally anywhere from a quarter to 3/4 of women experience sexual harassment during their lifetimes. I'll also mention, because I think this is something that I hope we talk about a little bit more down the line, but that sexual harassment is often doesn't exist in isolation. So if we look, for example, at the statistics from the EEOC, what we see is that Black women are most likely to file a charge for sexual harassment at work. And that very often that sexual harassment also involves things like racial discrimination. So I think when we're thinking about sexual harassment at work, we also have to think about discrimination on the basis of race, or age, or religion, or sexual and gender identity, or disability, that these things can combine to make it very difficult for people to be able to do their work, right? To do what they're there to do. So I hope that gives just a little bit of an overview. I will stop now and turn it over back to you or back to one of our panelists, AJ.
Yeah, does anyone have anything they want to pipe in? If not, I'd love to hear in contrast to that, and like the law side of things. I know, Amanda, you work a lot in more of like the streaming and entertainment side of gaming, and I'm really curious how your thoughts might contrast to the workplace.
Yeah, so actually, my dissertation is on women who work as streamers, particularly on Twitch, and I would absolutely argue that what they do is work, and that for them, you know, they're engaged in a process of turning their personal spaces into public workplaces that anyone can see into. And a lot of them do, as Dr. Corrigan said, end up in a weird position where they're technically like under contract or self-employed. And so sometimes miss out on a lot of these important protections. And for them, you know, they don't have some of the same recourses that someone in like a normal workplace would have. So for them, I would also say, yeah, I guess what I wanted to say as a contrast is like, it's for me, like harassment, thinking through like the second part of the question you had sent through in the email about how it's different from other challenges faced in the workplace. I think for most of us, there's an expectation that we should be protected from things like harassment, but a lot of women are expected to go into video game companies or to stream and are told like harassment is just part of the culture. It's part of the environment. It's something that you have to accept, get a thick skin, get over it, just work through it and it'll get better. And sometimes because of that sort of culture and how pervasive it is, it can be hard to even seek the resources and the help that you need, even when it's available, right? So I guess that's just the contrast or the complementary perspective I wanted to offer.
Yeah, as Anne Wilkerman, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's, you know, when we think about, I remember having conversations when the Me Too movement started, and, you know, male friends of mine who I thought of as pretty progressive, caring, compassionate, very aware of what sexual harassment was and is and how to behave, and, you know, that they were stunned by the number of women who said that they had been sexually harassed at some point in their life, in a job, in a workplace. And I think that's what really speaks to this issue. And that, you know, just as Amanda said, that it's you, and I had similar industries like the comic book industry. And I had a student who she lasted about a year and she could not take it anymore. She would have comments made, everything from what she was wearing to, you know, oh, it'd be better if you didn't wear a bra next time when you come to work. I mean, you know, and she went to HR, and HR literally said, well, you're in the comic book industry. What did you expect? You know, and, you know, that's when, you know, she felt like that was rape culture, that was, you know, oh, well, you know, why shouldn't they whistle at you? Why shouldn't they have attacked you? You know, your midriff was showing, or your skirt was too short, or, you know, and it was very frustrating to her. And just, but she was like, I couldn't get to anybody. HR was a woman who, and it was one person who just was like, what did you expect? She said, I'm lucky. I kind of can shut my door and don't have to deal with it, but you have to deal with it. So deal with it or leave.
Yeah.
And I just think that's, it speaks to obviously that this is a bigger issue, and we'll get into more of that as we continue the conversation.
I was also really curious about the point you made, Dr. Corrigan, about, and Amanda brought it up too, the fact that these laws only protect companies about, I think you said 50 employees, about over 50, and they don't cover contract work. But there are so many gaming studios, and Rachel, I don't know if you can speak to this at all, that like there are not many that are over 50 unless they're really big companies like Activision Blizzard. Like I've seen so many studios that maybe they have 12 people and they're independently contracted. And it just blows my mind that they wouldn't be protected, because that's kind of how game design works. It's very small groups of people. I didn't know if you could speak to this at all, Rachel, like your thoughts on it, or.
I'll just make just one clarification. Then it's
yeah.
The number is 15, 15, not 50.
Oh, 15.
Okay.
15. That's a very big difference. Yeah. Still though.
But still, right, for small companies.
Yeah, so I think especially it's trending in this direction, having more companies that work as outsourcing studios, or you're hired as a temp worker and the anticipation is that, maybe in 3 years you'll be brought on full time. But particularly the people who often work as contractors or temp workers are the people entering the industry, marginalized people who are probably the most at risk for harassment. And I think some states do have additional protections for folks in that position, but I'm sure it's not every state. So it's definitely a big gap of people in this industry that don't have that protection. And I'll also add on to what Dr. Corrigan said about, things that feel like harassment are not always legally defined as harassment. And Amanda, you mentioned that a lot of women or marginalized folks, when they come into the industry, they're kind of told, like, you should expect this to be part of your experience. I feel like for me and a lot of other women and marginalized people I know, that created this cloud of disclarity around what is harassment. Like, where is the line where I should start going to HR? Because absolutely, there are things that you're going to have happen, most likely just by virtue of, the demographics of the industry, where you will feel like you are not 100% respected in every situation. And it's hard sometimes to know, okay, what is the point at which this was too far? And I unfortunately find myself gauging that around, well, what do I think that, this collection of white cisgendered older men would consider to be harassment, right? Very rarely do I compare it against like what me and my other, mid to late 20-something coworkers would consider to be harassment. So it's a challenging topic, and I think people go too far in either direction sometimes, where some people let way too much slide, and then you have people on the other side where things that feel like harassment may not fall under the legal definition. They go to HR and they're kind of brushed off, and that's not a good feeling either. But I think it is different than the everyday, issues you're going to find in the workplace of someone making, a faux pas sort of comment, or you having to do education because you've just been more aware of, what people in the modern day consider to be like appropriate things to say to people. Not all of those situations, in my experience, would be considered harassment in the average workplace.
I want to just add something to that, Rachel, you mentioned HR, I mentioned HR. HR can't change this. This has to come from management, or it has to come from employees collectively. And I know one of the questions is about potentially unionizing, or it has to come from the consumer. And It's probably not going to come from the consumer, just would be my guess. So that leaves, employees a collective unit of employees, or it's management. It's going to take an awful long time for, younger, new, folks coming into the gaming industry to get into those management roles to make changes. So it's probably it's more of a collective, got to be a collective effort at the employee level. But I think Rachel's point about, how and also Dr. Corrigan's about, there's this legal definition of what harassment is, but then there's this feeling of what you're feeling if you're feeling like you're being targeted. Doesn't matter to you whether it's a legal definition or if it meets that legal bar if you're feeling targeted.
It feels like such a gray area where because everyone's so different. It's just like Rachel said, where do you draw that line? Or where do some people just go by the legal definition, or do some people draw it even sooner? And I guess that if anyone has nothing else they want to add, it does kind of tie into my next question, which is when you're going and applying to new companies, or even just learning about other companies, what are the green flags and what are the red flags that make either you specifically or just others you've heard about aware, I guess, of harassment in the workplace?
I'll start with that. Something I tell any student I'm speaking with, and I've written about this. When you're applying for a job, of course, the pandemic has made it a little challenging. We'll take the pandemic out of it for the time being. When you're going to interview, chances are you're going to go to the company to interview with them. I always tell folks, you need to be observant. One of the examples I've always used, if you were walking in like everyone's door shut, it's probably not going to be a place where there's a lot of interaction, and maybe that's what you want, and that's great. But if you're really an extrovert and you want to be chatting at the water cooler, then maybe that's not the right place. So for particularly a young woman or a marginalized individual, you might want to look at, what kind of pictures are up on people's cubicles, or, little things like that can tell you a lot about what that culture is like. I would guess, having not applied for a position in the gaming industry, that it's probably would be challenging for a young woman in particular, and probably even more so for a young woman of color, to ask about culture and expect any kind of, I don't want to say compassionate nor honest, because they might get an honest response, but certainly not what maybe they're looking for.
I'll jump in and give maybe a little bit of credit to game companies. I feel like they've at least caught on that this is an issue. A lot of them have targets at this point for, we'd like to have a larger base of marginalized people in working at our company. And I think that most of them would come now to expect questions, especially if you're going to interview, a young woman of color, for example, to get a question about, well, can I feel safe at your company? Maybe not in those words, but something that's getting at that. I've done a lot of interviewing and a lot of hiring over the past, however many years. And I will also say one challenge is that interviews are rarely on site for game companies, even outside of the pandemic. I've only ever traveled once for an interview to go on site, and that was after several phone interviews with teams, and that was a very large company. So typically the expectation is that you're going to do phone interviews, Skype calls, whatever, and then you make a decision. Do you want to move to this place? Or do you want to maybe visit our studio if you would like to do that on your own dime? that's kind of largely the expectation. So it does make it more difficult to gauge culture. Things that I always look for when I'm doing interviews, I think it's always really good if you can chat with someone who works at the company, who is preferably, if you are a marginalized person, try and find someone who is also a marginalized person to speak to their experience at the company. That can put people in hard positions, but if you're friends with them, it's a little bit easier. And if you do only get to do a phone interview or a Skype call with someone, think about who's in your interview process. When I was going through interviewing, and at this point I was only an associate producer, one of the things that I used to gauge what job I might want was who they put in the interviews. So there were some interviews where I only interviewed with the upper executives or the senior producers, and largely I didn't really get to speak to any of the associate or mid-level producers, which is where, as of today, you're going to find most of the marginalized people in production or most disciplines. But then there were some companies like Deck 9, which is where I ended up going to, where their whole production team was in those interviews, and I could see that when the woman in the room wanted to ask a question, she was not interrupted. She was given the floor. And that was a big selling point to me of why I decided to go there. So you can use those little things like that. Obviously, red flags, there's the common stuff, like if they talk about the studio being family, or we really want like a go-getter. Also look for what the job description is. If the job description is not particularly specific, I think that usually speaks to your role may not be very clear. People may not understand what you're going to be doing. And for me, as a younger woman, that always made my job a lot harder because I didn't have a clear expectation that I could point to and say, hey, I'm doing well at my job. So that isn't necessarily like a red flag for whether you're going to face harassment, but it might be a red flag for, will you be able to progress at this company? Because if no one in leadership understands your job or doesn't value it, you are probably going to have a hard time arguing why you should be getting raises versus your colleagues who are not in a marginalized community.
I'll also mention one thing, that whenever I know nothing about the gaming industry, I'm totally sorry, but I will say that at times when I have interviewed for jobs, one of the things that I'll look at are their things like their HR policies. So look at what they cover in their healthcare, right? Like, I don't have kids. I never wanted kids, but I always checked whether things like contraceptives were covered in the healthcare plan. I always looked at things like the parental leave policies, because lots of places will say things, but HR policies is where the rubber meets the road, and they've got to put their money where their mouth is. And if you go through, you may be able to identify, and if you do this with more than one, right, you can compare things, but you may be able to see, like, how much are they willing to support, for example, new parents? Right? Are they doing the bare minimum, or are they going above? And you don't have to want to be a parent in order to say, what does that say about the culture as a whole? What does that say about things like work-life balance, about respect for, people's commitments outside of work? So I think that can be another thing to check out, and to be aware that can be information that they would rather have you not see until after you accept the job.
I didn't even think about that. Yeah, that's so important. Amanda, I don't think we've heard from you yet. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
I was just thinking through, like, in terms of interviews. So I'm currently interviewing for faculty jobs, and maybe this would be similar in any sort of job interview, but thinking through, like, they're going to be asking you a lot of questions, but there's usually like 1 or 2 minutes given to you to ask questions. And I think one question for me that's been really important to ask is, why are you hiring for this position? Are you expanding your department, or are you replacing someone? And that answer can be really telling. If you're being told, like in the context of a video game company, that so-and-so was promoted or transferred to another division within the company, like, that's good news. That tells you that the company is the kind of place where people want to stay. But if they use that opportunity to say so-and-so quit, or even bad mouth, whoever it is that they're replacing, like that can be really telling for you too.
Yeah.
I also just wanted, to that point, I think if someone did resign, it's how they talk about that person, just as you said, because they could say, oh, Amanda left, she was, she went on, she's now a senior something. And if they talk very positively about that, this was a really big step up for this person, that shows that they care about that person's growth within their job. And that's a very positive sign.
Well, that was great. I love all of this advice. It's lovely. Thank you so much. I guess going into our third question of the night, kind of, let's say in an example, you go through this interview process, you don't catch the red flags or don't see any green flags, and you get into this job. And when you get there, you find out that this company is discriminatory, does harass people. For those that don't know, there's a term called crunch culture that's thrown around a lot in game development. The idea is that you as a developer are replaceable. Anyone will take your job. So you have to really put in the extra hours, the unpaid overtime to make your stay worth it, so that they don't get rid of you and replace you with someone else who would be willing to do those extra hours and unpaid overtime. So what do you do when you get into those situations? What are like good practices that active employees can use to protect themselves, and what can they do when they end up in bad situations? Because as you said, HR can only do so much.
Yeah, I'm happy to start with this one. I think as a producer, crunch culture is a big deal to me. Obviously, I work with schedules and making sure people have work-life balance. So I know that lots of studios still have, an issue with overtime, whether it's asked for or not. So I think if you are in a situation in which you are being explicitly kind of given too much work, right, for the amount of time that you have in a day, something that I've always worked on with people who are doing crunch-like activities, but they aren't being asked to, right? They're doing this out of their own volition. I'll sit down with that team member and really lay out the expectations for them. And I think as a person, you can, like as an employee who is not a producer, you can ask to do that with your manager or your producer. Something I see a lot or hear about a lot as well is folks who end up sitting at the studio and doing busy work because everyone else is here. And so it feels like if I'm not here, that's not going to be a good look. But I think hopefully you're in a situation where what is expected of you is the output and not you being present. So make it really clear what your goals are for, your week's worth of work. Make it clear what the quality target is, so that when you hit that and when your work is done, you can go home. Obviously, sometimes you will still be given too much work if you are in that situation, but at least then there won't be this ambiguity about like, what am I here for? Can I just noodle on this for the rest of the week, or can I go home? And then one big thing with discrimination that I've always been told, thankfully this was advice given to me by like older women in the game industry, was whenever you are in a situation in which you feel like what you're experiencing is harassment, or it could escalate into harassment, document everything. I'm sure all of us are going to give that advice, but for me, that's looked like try and get people to write their notes to you in emails or in written documentation, and then have it in some form where it can't be destroyed, right? Whether that's like saving it into a folder or something. And also when you have conversations with your HR person about what has happened to you, make sure that you follow up with them with an email. So they will know what you're doing. It may feel weird to do that, but any HR person will understand what's happening. And hopefully it will also motivate them to do something about it. Have a conversation with them about, hey, John said this thing to me. And when you go back to your desk, you send them an email and you say, hello, HR person, thank you for having a conversation with me today about what John said to me. Here's the things that we talked about. Here was what we agreed on doing next. Thank you so much. And in 6 months, if John has continued harassing you and you now have some sort of legal case, you will have documentation that they did not take any action to protect you.
I just want to add one thing there, not to be the negative Nelly, but just a reminder that HR's function is to protect the company.
Yes.
So it's not to protect the employee. Now, they may sometimes do, protect employees and offer things that are beneficial to employees and so forth, but their primary purpose and function is to protect the company from risk, lawsuits, etc. So I just wanted to put that out there. So, because we do keep saying, like, if you go to HR and so forth, which I'm not saying you shouldn't do, you just need to understand what their function and role is. So
like thinking through that, sorry.
Oh, you go. I was commenting.
I was just gonna say, like, thinking through that documentation angle, I mean, not just like written documentation. What I was gonna talk about or suggest for this point was the power of talking to your coworkers. Talk to things like, about like the weird conversation that you had with John. I mean, just look at the power or the momentum that the Activision Blizzard sort of employees built around that lawsuit just by talking to each other about it. Like, things like harassment and discrimination thrive in secrecy. So like just talking to your coworkers, if not your direct reports, about the things that make you uncomfortable. And also, I think I'll also open up the floor to things like pay. Like, talk to each other about pay. That's how you end up in a situation, I think Rachel mentioned, where you might find that you are being underpaid than someone in your same position. And it could be, for any number of illegal reasons. But yeah, I think just like talking to your coworkers and that sort of like informal documentation of things that are going on.
I think, oh, go ahead, AJ.
Oh, no, I was going to say, because I'm really curious from a legal perspective to ask you. I've heard from some people that sometimes taking documentation is a bad idea because it could get you into bad situations when trying to convict someone. I was curious from like a law perspective if that was true or if it was just people being paranoid.
Generally, the more documentation you have, the better. If you can say on June 16th, John and I had this conversation, and then you documented that. And then 2 weeks later, we had another conversation. I thought that again crossed a line. So I talked to HR. Here's the email from HR. Here's their response, right? For the legal side of it, the more you can document time, day, who knew about it, who advised you to just, well, John's just a little weird, right? Just come on, don't be so sensitive. You're being, hypercritical, whatever. Or for the women, you're being a bee, right? Just relax. So I generally on the legal side, the more documentation you have, the better. But I will say again, right? Remember that like the ideal is that things don't get to the point where illegal things have happened, right? I think that exactly what Amanda was talking about, talking with coworkers and sharing information is a way to create culture change, hopefully before a situation ever got to the point of harassment. And you know what? Maybe John just is a little bit weird, right? Lots of us have eccentricities or just strange habits. We might just rub someone the wrong way, whatever. But like things don't have to wait. You could potentially talk with a couple of coworkers and then hopefully maybe with some assistance from HR, but have like a helpful conversation. John, you keep doing this. It makes me uncomfortable. I would like you to stop. Right. And the dream is that those conversations happen and behaviors change before anyone needs to file a lawsuit. If things do get bad and lawsuits do need to be filed, I will just mention that, again, the link for the EEOC that I put in the chat, they investigate allegations of sexual harassment. Unions can be very powerful, effective allies. They have lawyers on staff who can absolutely provide advice and often free legal assistance to people who are bringing charges of harassment, discrimination. There's also a lot of legal services organizations that can provide assistance, very often free assistance. So for example, right here in Philadelphia, we have the Women's Law Project, which provides services to people across Pennsylvania. And not only around general forms of employment discrimination women might experience, like, for example, if you're told that you can't pump at work, like you can't pump breast milk at work, or if you're being discriminated against during your pregnancy. And then Women's Law Project also has recently developed a specific project called Me Too PA, which provides free confidential assistance for individuals who are experiencing sexual harassment at school or at work. And so that's where you can actually talk to someone, have a lawyer evaluate, your situation, and they may be able to provide additional legal assistance. But, I think that very often the hope would be that you have a workplace culture that is open to change and improvement before things get to the worst possible sort of experience for everyone, which is, again, something like a lawsuit.
Yeah, and I'll chime in. I personally, I don't know how public it would ever be, but I personally have never known anyone who took legal action against, a game company they've worked for. I think partially, people end up leaving, or they won't take action because there's a fear that if you do so, what company is then going to hire you? So I will say the non-legal routes that Dr. Corrigan talked about are most commonly going to be what you're going to experience, right? You're going to have a meeting with HR, you're going to talk directly with this person, which always feels scary, but often in my experience has been the best way to solve those problems quickly, as long as they are not, willfully malicious against you. So hopefully that's a situation that you find yourself in. I don't think most marginalized game developers would find themselves in like a legal battle in their early careers, at least, for sure.
But that still does kind of raise the point, though, like what Ms. Wilkerman said. The HR isn't there to protect you; it's there to protect the company. And I think you guys kind of skipped ahead of me a bit in our questions, but kind of going into the next one, which is like, what is the role of a union? When are they useful? Because I see so many game unions popping up now. Like, when are unions useful? And then when are the other resources you all mentioned useful? Or is there like cross and overlap between them?
I'll just jump in and mention, as far as I know, someone please correct me if I'm wrong, but there is no union in America for game developers outside of, if we're considering like a voice actor, a game developer, SAG-AFTRA, a lot of game voice actors are part of SAG. But as of today, there is no legally recognized union in America for game developers. So I would just put that out there. There's a lot of talk about unions as how they can be helpful. I'll also say I did attend some workshops at GDC, Game Developers Conference, a few years ago about unions out of interest for, what would the process be if anyone wanted to start one at the company they worked at. And the folks they had come were, they were part of industry unions, and they were very open about the fact that it is very difficult to create a legally recognized union, which is why I think there's so much more of the informal collective bargaining that we see, using resources like special interest groups within like individual companies or within groups like the IGDA. And then, I'll let Amanda talk about Game Workers Unite. I know that a few years ago they were making a lot of headway, but I haven't heard as much about them recently. So please.
Yeah, no, I didn't have much to say other than just to point out they existed. So I'm located in Irvine. I am like 15 minutes down the street from Blizzard. It's a lot of fun. And I do know that several of the game companies around here had employees that were active in that, but that was pre-pandemic. I feel like maybe things have stalled out a bit. So I will say that, like, from my perspective and what I refer my students in the game design major here at UCI towards, are joining things like the local chapter of IGDA, which is the International Game Developers Association. They often have local chapters where members discuss issues like this. They also have special interest groups within IGDA for different sorts of roles, as well as populations within the game industry. Those can be really helpful to join for resources as well. But I mean, what Rachel said is true. Ultimately, there is no official union for game workers yet.
It was actually funny you say that because the Philadelphia chapter of IGDA actually, pre-pandemic, met in this very space that we're in right now. Now they just meet online because it's a pandemic still, but.
Yeah, I actually used to be the chair of the Philadelphia IGDA, and yeah, and I was part of the team that helped reboot it. I have a lot of respect for the people who run the IGDA and the work that they do in advocacy in the industry. But I will say, much to perhaps my dismay as a young developer, they have no interest in becoming a legally recognized force for bargaining in the industry. I think that if there was something that started, they might be helpful in that. But right now, yeah, they are really the primary force in at least social, like industry-wide change publicly.
Yeah, that might raise a good question then, I guess, to our panelists who are out of industry in games. Out of the game design industry, what do you guys feel the role of a union is? And maybe we can see if that's even something that would be worthwhile to introduce into a new culture in a sense.
So this is funny. In my, I'm teaching constitutional law right now, and we just did like the progressive era and the New Deal, which is all about union organizing. And I understand people have different feelings or experiences with unions. There are lots of different types of unions that provide different sorts of, that have different sorts of relationships with their members and relationships with employers. But generally the point of unions is to level the playing field, right? Because, you know, Rachel, you had mentioned sort of, you know, crunch culture, and AJ, you were talking about how, you know, workers are seen as disposable. And frankly, in the United States, that's been true for a really long time in lots of different industries. And so historically, like over the last 100 years, unions have been a way to counter that power of employers and for people to come together and through collective action, be able to level that playing field and gain power for themselves and be able to negotiate in a more equal sort of setting than any one of us could do on our own. And like I said, one of the real benefits of unions is that typically they do have legal professionals on staff. So for example, in addition, like if you went to HR and they were unhelpful or bad, you could, if you were part of a union, often you could access legal professionals through the union and be able to have someone look over your case and talk to you about your experiences, and they might be able to help you navigate whatever systems you're dealing with. So, and litigation is incredibly expensive. So the EEOC, as I mentioned, does handle issues of sexual harassment, and they do that, but depending on how you frame the claim, it's always great to get a free lawyer. So I think for many people, like that historically has been why we've turned to unions and how they've been powerful and effective in bargaining to get workers better rights and conditions.
And I'll just give you a very small example, but it could lead to this discussion, about culture and the overtime and that sort of crunch culture. My daughter worked for a charter school in Massachusetts. She did Teach for America. It's her first time teaching. She literally was not allowed to go to the bathroom from 7:30 in the morning until 2:30 in the afternoon. She was not allowed to leave her classroom, and unless someone could come down and relieve her so that she could go to the bathroom, she was not allowed to go to the bathroom. Fast forward, she's now teaching in the Philadelphia School District, and when she was applying for the job, her principal, or she'd been accepted, offered the job, the principal was asking about her schedule and, would you have a preference for this or for that? And she chose one that was a longer period of time when she would teach back-to-back classes. And she said, "Are you sure you won't have a break?" And she said, "Oh no, I'm used to I had to go like 6 hours or 7 hours without going to the bathroom." And she said, oh, the union would never allow that. So in terms of the gaming industry, where a union would probably be most beneficial to the broader gaming industry, not just in terms of like sexual harassment, but would be this idea of the crunch culture and overtime and what would be allowable, when would overtime pay have to kick in, how many hours. I mean, I just did a little, looking, and to a 2019 gaming survey, 70% of the workforce reported working more than 50 hours a week during, sort of crunch time, that could last for weeks or months. So that's where, for the entire gaming industry, a union would be really beneficial as well.
I'll also just add as a side note, something that the IGDA does like surveys on every year. They do like a state of the game industry sort of questionnaire for game developers, is what kind of support is there for unionizing? And I think a lot of people would be surprised at how little support there is in the industry for a union. I think that a lot of people are looking for other options, or they think something needs to happen, but I think it's just something interesting that a lot of people who work in the game industry do not necessarily see unions as the answer to the issues. And perhaps partially because of how much the game industry is like a glamour sort of industry where can you unionize when there's 15 people behind you who would like to have your job? Why would your company not just fire you all and pick up another whole workforce of people? It's also interesting because, sorry, I'm going on a tangent, but it's interesting because there's two kinds of unions, at least that I'm familiar with. There's the industry-wide union, something like SAG-AFTRA, where you've got all of these people who do similar job or in the same industry. And then you've got studio-specific unions. And I personally, and I think a lot of people share this opinion, don't really see a lot of hope for an industry-wide union, partially because people's jobs are so wildly different. Somebody working as a programmer at Activision, how can they be given support that somebody who works at a 5-person company and is an artist would need? So I think that complicates things. And then a studio-specific union would need to, I think, come from a very big studio and probably be led by like their most senior, most valuable people who also potentially have the least to gain by starting a union. So personally, I look at other options as the most realistic solution. One, because of just how hard starting a union is, and two, because I think this industry is not necessarily the most set up like culturally for unionizing.
That's a really good point. Yeah. Well, we're quickly running out of time, and I don't want to take up too much more of your time. So thank you so much so far. We spoke about it a bit earlier, this idea of like bringing more communication into the workplace and having people like talk to each other about things like pay and harassment and discrimination and crunch and all these things, like opening up communication. But since we're obviously not going to solve the problem of unionizing tonight in the next 6 minutes, what other practices do you feel like people should be bringing into the workplace as they graduate, as they go on their internships and co-ops, as they just move forward in their life? What good practices could they bring?
So something that we've tried with like the UCI esports program was we redesigned green dot training, which is bystander intervention training. And part of it is just to get people to recognize what might look like harassment in gaming contexts, both online and in gaming environments online. But mostly it's just sort of getting at this idea that like, just because it's not happening to you doesn't mean that you're not accountable or that you shouldn't do something about it. So just like shared responsibility, I guess, and like compassion for your coworkers, and like training yourself in a number of ways how to respond to something. So again, just sort of like this collective action, like don't just do it for yourself, do it for your peers too.
And I think I don't think we can stress enough this idea of talking, and whether it's just talking across the industry to raise awareness, or whether it's talking with fellow co-ops, you know, in a co-op, or it's talking with the other employees in the co-op, at that co-op, or it's your first job, to ask questions, to find out what, you know, other people are doing and thinking and sharing, and you know, it does help form a bond, and it does help, you know, it's much easier to discriminate against people when you don't view them as human beings with feelings and thoughts and emotions. So the more that, you know, young people coming into this industry can form these bonds with one another, and, you know, it's not going to solve everything by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it's got to be a multi-pronged approach. But I think talking and building relationships through talking and understanding what other people are doing, what other experiences people have had, listening, being observant, standing up when you hear that something doesn't sound right. And that's got to be really tough, I know, for a co-op student, but sometimes that can just be like, gee, you know, are you okay going up to someone after someone has said something to them? You know, I get not everyone's going to feel safe or comfortable to call somebody out depending on their role, but you can at least go and speak to the person who was on the receiving end.
I'd also say that I think bravery is a muscle, and you have to practice and you have to exercise. And I think that there can be opportunities to do that for other people. Sometimes I think a lot of us are braver about defending other people's rights or standing up for other people, like our friends, than we are for ourselves sometimes. So like if that's a place to start, then start in that place, and then practice also standing up and recognizing that you are also worth protecting and defending, that you have a right to work in a place that respects you, that treats you like a human being and treats other people like human beings. And, you know, like if you have to start small, that's okay. But I think the more you practice it, and I have been a mouthy, like, you know, person who has not stood for a lot of nonsense at most jobs I've had. And I think I'm always shocked at how much easier it gets and how willing people are to listen. And so I realized, I know it's so scary. You know, I was sexually harassed at one of my first jobs right out of college. So I really get that sense of precarity and how scary that can feel. But I think it's like you start where you can and then keep practicing. And I think many of us would be surprised and impressed at how brave we can actually be.
Yeah, I think a lot of marginalized people in the game industry feel very strongly about the culture and the experience of people who are entering the game industry. So if there's somewhere that you're interested in working or doing an internship at, you know, I think it's advisable to reach out to people who work there, particularly other marginalized people. It can feel scary to just, you know, send someone a cold email or send them a Twitter message. But I think largely most people working in the game industry want to help other people and want to help them find a safe place that they feel like is a good fit for them. My other advice is just look for jobs that aren't necessarily what you thought was going to be your dream job when you were 15, right? I feel like a lot of game developers are extremely, you know, they come up with the idea that they want to be game developers when they're still pretty young. They have a studio that they consider to be like their dream studio. And it's funny I'm saying this because Firaxis was like totally my dream studio when I was a kid, but it's worked out, so that's good. It does not work out for everyone though. So, you know, branch out a little bit. You don't have to work at Nintendo as your first job. And there are a lot of studios you've never heard of making games that do very well financially. Some of my friends, for example, have started working on like games for Roblox, right? And like game developers don't think about that as their dream job, but those are the kinds of places where you probably are going to find more people who are like a parent, right? Because they want some stability. They don't want to be crunching, making the next blockbuster game. They want to go to work for 40 hours every week and go home and see their kid. So try and find studios like that. That's something that I really like about Firaxis is that a lot of the people I work with have kids. They're a little bit older. They just really value their work-life balance. So that was a big selling point for me, for example. But yeah, consider things that are not the mainstream choices.
Thank you. Miranda, do you have anything you want to add as a last little bit, or? No, if not, then I guess we will, if you guys are all right with it, since I know it's technically 7:01, and I hate to hold you for too long. Are you all right if we open the floor to a few minutes of questions? I think I see nodding and thumbs up. It's so hard to tell.
We're good.
All right. In that case, I'll open it to the room behind me first, and then chat will go to you next. Is there anyone in the room with me right now who has questions? And you think about it a few times. Well, we have Frank. Frank's here. He's the manager of EGS and like the director of everything. So you want to slide in the frame, Frank?
Yes, yes. Well, first of all, as a professor at Drexel and the director of Bravery Is, I just want to thank everyone for participating in the panel. I tried to stay back as much as possible, mainly because AJ is the one that put this together, and I just want to have all the spotlight on AJ. The question that I have is, as someone that kind of regularly reads news from I guess a consumer point of view, my sense is that because of the strong conservative bent of the Supreme Court, as well as past conservative Congress, the power of the union has essentially diminished over time, at least certainly within the last 20 years. My sense is the membership in the unions has sort of gone down, as well as some of the rulings by the Supreme Court about membership fees, I think, that has also sort of taken a lot of the power money away from the unions. So I'm wondering whether what the future of union is, regardless of whether it's gaming in union or not, but whether that direction that I sort of see of the diminishment of unions is way it's going to the future.
Did you guys hear that all right? Or
In and out a little bit.
Yeah.
Was it about the Supreme Court and unions? Was that?
yeah, so the general question was, it looks like based on like Supreme Court rulings on unions, there's been this push against them and against their existence. And do you feel like there is even a future in unions just outside of gaming in general?
So I would say, and I'm not a scholar of unions, but I would say yes. The unions really came under attack in the early 1980s. That was when the federal government sort of made a move against unions, and the Supreme Court over the last decade or so has actually handed down a number of decisions that do undercut some of the power of unions, make them more difficult to organize. Things like, I think I heard the things like union fees, people can choose not to contribute to a union even if they're represented by it. And I think, at this point, only the last stats I saw were maybe about 12% of Americans are represented by unions. So we've certainly seen a huge decrease over the last, say, 40 years or so. But I think particularly over the last 10 or 15 years, we've also seen a real increase in the interest in unions, right? So unions like SEIU have come out doing really interesting, innovative work to try to unionize and organize people. And so I think, but at the same time, right, I think Rachel's exactly correct that we've now gone a whole generation without strong union representation. And I think for many people, there's a real gap in terms of understanding why unions might have been helpful. I think much of the mainstream discussions about unions tend to be fairly negative. And I think all of that influences people's willingness to think about a union on top of how difficult it is to actually organize one. But I think that, we've seen unionizing happen in sectors of the economy that we never really thought would be viable, things like home health aides, right? And so I don't think there's any particular reason why people in the gaming industry couldn't be a part of a union. And there might be different ways to think about what those unions would look like or what's the right place for that. Or like maybe your generation is going to reinvent what collective organizing or at work looks like. Right. And I think that's exciting. I don't think it has to look like it's always looked for us to think about how can working together create powerful protections for employees.
Is there anything anyone else would like to add to that? Or that was really great. Thank you. Check the chat for questions. I don't see any questions in the chat. There's a lot of things said. Yeah. Oh, we have one question from Tom. Tom, do you want to talk to the front?
Hello. Thanks for coming out tonight. I wanted to ask. I'm cis white gendered or cisgendered white male who wants to do his part as best he can. I'd like to, I guess, hear from everyone what's like one thing that I can do to sort of make sure that not only am I not like being an active somebody who's actively harassing anyone, but to prevent that around me.
I would say, number one, listen. Number two, practice self-reflection. And then number three, really hold other men accountable. Other men, if it's majority of men harassing women or marginalized individuals, then men holding men accountable can help create culture change. But I think you have to listen and you have to ask questions as well.
Thank you. Anyone have anything else they want to add to that answer? Or?
Yeah, I think probably the most impactful things for me when I was a junior in games, and this was done by both men who were my senior and also men who were at the same seniority level as me, was just kind of quietly seconding things. And this is not just for women, right? I think this is for anyone of a marginalized identity. It's often very scary to throw out something against the status quo or what the room maybe has experienced into this void of like a meeting room or something like that. And you get this sort of silence as people process what you've said or think about whether they agree with whatever stance you've taken. But I think that men who would just kind of say like, yeah, after I said something like, hey, maybe, I don't know, I'm going to pick a hypothetical, it's like a fake example, but, maybe this character should not do battle in high heels, right? Okay. That's a very extreme example, but, someone just going, okay, or something like that, I think lends a lot of credence in the room to, we should consider this idea. So yeah, I think that's a pretty simple thing to do that. I used to leave meetings and men would be like, I agreed with you. And I'm like, why didn't you say something? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. If anyone has any other questions, I guess, in the room or I don't see any more in the chat. Yeah, I don't see any more in the chat. So with that, I think that's a good place to end it. Thank you guys so much for coming. This was like really informative, and I'm really excited for everything that I learned. I don't know about anyone else, but I feel like I really learned a lot just hearing from you guys. So thank you so much for being here. And if for anyone interested who maybe didn't have access to the chat during this, Dr. Rose Corrigan is going to be sending me all of the links that she sent throughout the evening from the chat to my email, and then I'll make sure to get that out to everyone as quickly as possible whenever this is also released onto YouTube and wherever else it may go. So thank you so much, everyone. And I hope you all have a good night and a good week.
Thanks to be here.
Thank you.
I will stop the recording there.